The morning of November 20, 1944, near the German border in eastern France, Sergeant Francis Baker crouched inside the turret of his M4 Sherman tank. This was the upgraded model, equipped with the new 76mm gun that Army Ordnance had promised would change everything. Through his periscope, Baker spotted a German Mark V Panther emerging from the tree line, roughly 800 yards away, its long gun sweeping slowly across the terrain, searching. Baker's crew had trained for weeks on this new weapon. The briefings had been clear and emphatic: this gun would handle anything the Germans threw at them. No more helplessly watching rounds bounce off enemy armor. No more suicidal flanking maneuvers that left American tanks burning in the French countryside. The 76mm gun was meant to be a deliverance, a technological solution to the tactical nightmare that had haunted American armored units since Normandy. Baker gave the order. His gunner, steady and precise, fired the first round into the Panther's exposed side, clearly visible through the gun sight. Baker expected the familiar secondary explosion, the telltale smoke signaling a successful kill. Instead, to his shock and dismay, the armor-piercing round ricocheted off the German tank's flank, carrying all the velocity and penetrative power that Army Ordnance had assured would defeat enemy armor. It bounced away, disappearing into the gray November sky like a stone skipping across water. Again and again, the gunner fired. 6 more rounds struck the Panther, hitting the turret, the tracks, and the side armor. 7 direct hits. 7 failures. The German tank, as if recognizing the heightened threat posed by this new weapon, began to withdraw. Baker watched in stunned disbelief as it drove away. After surviving 7 hits from America's newest tank gun, the weapon meant to restore parity in European armored combat. Something had gone fundamentally wrong. This moment of stunned disbelief, repeated across dozens of engagements during the autumn and winter of 1944, went beyond mere tactical setback. It symbolized the collapse of institutional promises made to men whose survival depended on their equipment performing as advertised. The 76mm gun had arrived in Europe, backed by assurances from the highest levels of Army command. Senior officers had staked their reputations on claims that this weapon would neutralize the terrible disadvantage American tankers faced against German heavy armor. The story of the 76mm gun did not begin with its failure in combat but with the desperate circumstances that demanded its creation. By the spring of 1944, American armored forces preparing for the invasion of Europe recognized a serious problem. The standard M4 Sherman tank, backbone of American armored doctrine, carried a 75mm M3 gun, which had performed adequately in North Africa against Panzer III and early Panzer IV tanks. Its high explosive round was effective for infantry support, and its armor-piercing ammunition could defeat most German armor encountered in the Mediterranean theater. Tank crews had developed confidence in this weapon through repeated successful engagements. But intelligence reports from the Eastern Front and German-occupied Europe painted a worrying picture. The Germans had introduced the Tiger I heavy tank, mounting an 88mm gun behind frontal armor 100mm thick. Even more concerning was the Panther, a medium tank combining heavy armor, excellent mobility, and a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of penetrating American tanks at over 2,000 meters. German armor technology had advanced significantly since North Africa, and American tankers preparing to invade Fortress Europe would face opponents whose equipment held decisive advantages. American tank doctrine emphasized the Sherman as a mobile infantry support vehicle rather than a dedicated tank destroyer. Separate tank destroyer battalions, equipped with specialized guns, were tasked with defeating enemy armor. Shermans were expected to exploit breakthroughs, support infantry, reduce fortifications, and engage enemy tanks only when necessary, and preferably from advantageous positions. This doctrine reflected both tactical theory and an honest assessment of the Sherman's capabilities with the 75mm gun. To address this limitation, American ordnance engineers developed the 76mm M1 gun, a high-velocity weapon with ballistics matching the 3-inch anti-tank gun used by tank destroyer units, packaged compactly for the Sherman turret. The new gun fired a longer, heavier projectile at substantially higher muzzle velocity. The 75mm M3 gun's armor-piercing rounds achieved 2,300 feet per second. The 76mm M1 fired its M79 shot at 2,600 feet per second, a 25% increase translating directly into improved penetration. On paper, the upgrade was impressive. The 75 mm gun could penetrate roughly 60 mm of armor angled at 30 degrees at 1,000 yards. The 76 mm, using the same armor-piercing capped ammunition, could penetrate about 109 mm under identical conditions, nearly double. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground supported these results, and senior commanders were briefed that the 76 mm could handle any German armor. This assurance carried enormous weight with units preparing for Operation Overlord. Tank battalion commanders received unambiguous promises. The 76 mm would defeat Tigers and Panthers, restore tactical parity, and eliminate the need for risky flanking maneuvers. These assurances came from technical experts, not casual speculation. Combat commanders had every reason to trust that their lives and tactics rested on reliable analysis, not wishful thinking. The first 76 mm Shermans arrived in Europe in April 1944, in time for the Normandy invasion. The tanks had a longer barrel, a bulkier turret, and a more aggressive silhouette, clearly signaling improved capability. Yet commanders were hesitant. The 76 mm fired a smaller high-explosive round than the 75 mm, 0.86 pounds versus 1.47 pounds, reducing effectiveness in the Sherman's primary role supporting infantry and destroying fortifications. Logistics were also a concern. Separate ammunition types, extra spare parts, and new training increased administrative burdens. Moreover, most commanders felt the 75 mm gun was adequate. German Panthers and Tigers had not yet been encountered in significant numbers, and the 75 mm could handle the Panzer IVs most common in intelligence reports. Theoretical improvements seemed less compelling than proven performance. This judgment led to a critical decision. When Operation Overlord launched on June 6, 1944, No. 76 mm Shermans landed on the beaches. The invasion proceeded with the standard 75 mm, familiar but vulnerable. Even attempts to interest General Patton in the new gun failed. This cautious decision would soon prove disastrous. German forces in France concentrated their most capable armor in preparation for the Allied invasion. American crews, equipped with 75 mm guns, would soon confront the deadly consequences. The availability of 76 mm guns as a theoretical reserve had provided planners reassurance, but only if the weapon performed as promised. That foundation of trust was about to crumble. American forces advancing inland from Normandy faced terrain that negated many Sherman advantages while amplifying vulnerabilities. Hedgerows, thick embankments, and narrow corridors funneled movement, creating perfect ambush sites. German tanks could expose only their turrets while firing, making frontal attacks suicidal. American tank crews quickly learned the hard way that their 75 mm guns could not penetrate Panther or Tiger frontal armor. The 2nd Armored Division experienced this brutal education firsthand during the breakthrough battles of July and August 1944. Crews developed desperate tactics, using encircling maneuvers to attack from the sides or rear, accepting appalling casualties. Between July 26 and August 12, one tank battalion lost 51% of its personnel and 70% of its tanks. These were not failures of courage or numbers, but of material reality, inadequate weapons forcing crews into exposed positions. Survivors adapted, finding weak points on Panthers and Tigers, coordinating artillery to disable enemy equipment, and accepting losses as part of survival. Bureaucracy responded slowly. Requests for 76 mm Shermans reached front lines gradually. By November 1944, roughly half of the 2nd Armored Division's Shermans mounted the 76 mm gun. The upgraded tanks arrived with assurances of effectiveness. Tank crews, battle-hardened and desperate, embraced them with relief bordering on hope. Training emphasized the higher velocity, heavier projectile, and longer rounds. For the first time since Normandy, American tankers believed they possessed weapons capable of defeating German heavy armor frontally. Yet the Royal River Offensive in November 1944, beginning with the battle at Pfuffendorf on November 17, revealed a troubling reality. Terrain prevented traditional flanking maneuvers, forcing direct tank-on-tank combat, the scenario where the 76 mm was supposed to excel. But crews found that rounds often failed to penetrate Panthers as promised. Hits on flanks or rear worked, but frontal engagements produced inconsistent results. This was not a failure of training or tactics but a metallurgical issue. American armor-piercing projectiles had soft noses that could shatter on impact at certain velocities, a phenomenon called the shatter gap. For the 76mm M62 shell, this occurred between 50 and 900 meters, covering most combat ranges. Within this band, rounds could fail unpredictably despite sufficient energy for penetration. American tank crews discovered this problem firsthand, not in briefings, but by watching their rounds bounce off German armor, the weapon they had been promised as salvation proving unreliable. 2. The psychological impact of this discovery on American tank crews cannot be overstated. Soldiers entering combat with the 76mm gun had been promised a weapon capable of handling any German tank. They trusted institutional assurances, reinforced by testing that supposedly validated these claims. When the weapon consistently failed in the field, especially in frontal engagements, the most dangerous and desperate of battles, it shattered confidence in the military's technical expertise. Crews began to doubt whether any official claims about equipment performance could be trusted. Sergeant Francis Baker's engagement on November 20 was just one example of many. Experienced crews, firing upgraded weapons at targets within their theoretical effective range, watched American ammunition fail against German armor. Baker struck a Panther 7 times on its side, the armor thinner and less steeply angled than the frontal plates, but not a single hit penetrated. Ordnance testing data suggested that 7 precise strikes should have produced at least 1 kill. The total failure indicated something fundamentally wrong, either the ammunition, the testing methodology, or the way the results were translated into combat assessments. HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, ammunition was introduced to address this problem with higher velocity. Yet it was so scarce that its tactical impact remained negligible. Tank destroyer battalions received priority allocation, leaving Sherman crews with only a handful of rounds per gun. Crews hoarded these precious shells for emergencies against the heaviest German tanks, knowing that once spent, they would return to standard ammunition whose limitations had been painfully proven. This scarcity reinforced the perception that institutional promises were hollow. The gap between official assurances and battlefield reality reached the highest echelons of American command during the Normandy campaign. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had received optimistic briefings on the 76mm gun's capabilities. When combat reports revealed that the gun could not reliably destroy Panthers frontally, his reaction exposed how deeply the institutional failure penetrated decision-making. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army in Normandy, recalled Eisenhower's consternation. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war. Why am I always the last to hear about this? Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." This was more than frustration over a single weapon system, it revealed the failure of the entire institutional process for evaluating and fielding equipment. Strategic decisions, resource allocation, and operational risks had been based on technical assurances that proved fundamentally inaccurate against German armor. The tactical consequences were severe. The disparity between American and German armor meant that success required either overwhelming numbers, extensive air support, or acceptance of unsustainable casualty rates. None of these options were ideal. Army Ordnance's response emphasizing controlled testing, protocol adherence, and representative armor samples ignored the fundamental reality: testing that did not predict actual combat performance was useless. By late 1944, American tank crews faced complex tactical scenarios. German tank production had peaked, but quality suffered as manufacturing dispersed, labor grew less skilled, and materials were substituted. Some tanks arrived with mechanical flaws, poorly fitted components, or inconsistent armor that sometimes failed at lower thresholds than predicted. This variability meant American crews occasionally achieved successful penetrations, only to fail on seemingly identical targets later. The unpredictability was psychologically devastating, preventing crews from developing reliable tactics. They only learned the true effectiveness of their weapons in life-or-death combat. The institutional response evolved slowly. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, mounting a 90mm gun capable of reliably defeating German heavy armor, existed in limited prototype numbers but faced resistance from senior commanders influenced by tank destroyer doctrine. Production prioritized Shermans, which could be manufactured and maintained efficiently, leaving crews to fight the final year with inadequate weapons. American tank crews adapted out of necessity. Survival depended on tactics, coordination, and calculated risks rather than doctrine. They learned never to engage German heavy armor frontally if alternatives existed. Identifying Panthers and Tigers at maximum visual range became critical. Sherman platoons would maneuver for flank shots, using terrain, buildings, and vegetation to mask movements. One platoon would fix the enemy's attention, risking return fire, while the second executed the flanking maneuver, the only realistic chance of a kill. Coordination and communication were vital, as terrain often prevented visual contact. Radio discipline and constant awareness of friendly positions prevented fratricide and enabled complex movements under fire. When flanking was impossible, artillery support became essential, damaging optics, tracks, and external equipment to suppress enemy crews. Air support also played a critical role. Fighter bombers could destroy German tanks that ground forces could not engage effectively, coordinated by tank crews marking targets with smoke or tracer rounds. The psychological toll was immense. Crews developed fatalistic attitudes, witnessing friends die while their own weapons failed. Replacement crews received brutally honest assessments from veterans. The official optimism of U.S. training was gone. Men understood that institutional promises meant nothing against German 88mm guns. Mission success often required sacrificing tanks and crews. Commanders calculated attrition, weighing losses against operational necessity. This brutal arithmetic acknowledged the grim reality: refusal to engage meant allowing German armor to operate freely, resulting in even higher casualties. The 76mm gun's failure reflected broader patterns in American equipment development during World War II. Testing, performance evaluation, and procurement often diverged from combat reality, disadvantaging troops and costing lives unnecessarily. Optimistic assessments were driven by patriotic desire, organizational incentives, and pressure to meet production schedules. Dissent was discouraged, and subordinates felt compelled to validate senior commanders' decisions rather than highlight critical flaws. German armor development contrasted sharply. Panthers and Tigers prioritized decisive advantages in armor and firepower, despite mechanical complexity, high production costs, and logistical strain. German crews could justifiably trust their equipment. U.S. doctrine emphasized quantity, sustainability, and logistics over individual vehicle performance, a strategically sound approach despite its human cost. American forces advanced through France and Germany, leveraging superior numbers, supply chains, air support, and trained personnel to overcome tactical disadvantages. The 76mm gun's failure mattered deeply to crews who paid with their lives but did not alter the strategic outcome. American factories produced roughly 50,000 Shermans, while Germany produced just over 7,800 Panthers and Tigers combined. Victory depended on numbers and attrition, not parity in equipment. Casualty statistics, such as the 2nd Armored Division's losses between July and August 1944, 51% of personnel and 70% of tanks, highlight the human price of inadequate weapons. The M26 Pershing arrived in February 1945, 8 months after D-Day and only months before Germany's surrender. It provided exactly what crews had needed: a tank capable of engaging Panthers and Tigers without suicidal flanking. Yet only about 300 Pershings deployed to Europe, a fraction of American armor. Most Sherman crews fought the entire campaign with 75 or 76mm guns, never receiving equipment that could restore tactical parity. For those who survived to see the Pershing, there was bitter vindication, mingled with anger over lives lost unnecessarily. The 76mm gun's failure illustrates systemic problems: overpromising, underdelivering, and institutional defensiveness. American tank crews accomplished their missions despite, not because of, institutional support. Their success stemmed from courage, skill, and numerical superiority, overcoming material disadvantages they should never have faced. The story honors their achievement while acknowledging the unnecessary costs of institutional failure. On that November morning in 1944, Sergeant Baker saw 7 rounds bounce off a Panther and realized a hard truth: the Wonder Gun had failed. Survival would depend on tactics, luck, and the courage of men who fought knowing their weapons were inadequate.